So Camilla reportedly collapsed in the royal council chamber right after they stripped her title and handed it directly to Catherine. And look, even if you take the palace gossip with a grain of salt, the timeline here is genuinely messy. Because the story isn't just about a fainting spell, it's about how a woman who spent decades fighting for legitimacy allegedly spent her final months of power quietly rewriting the king's instructions behind his back. And the moment that caught everyone's attention wasn't the collapse itself, it was the empty signature line. Charles didn't sign the final order, so the whole thing was technically reversible, which means the most dramatic moment in this entire saga might have been a performance, a hesitation, or a genuine breakdown, depending on who you believe. Before we get into the details, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next update on this story. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel. Now, the Royal Council is this private advisory body inside the palace. They don't make public laws. They handle internal governance, ceremonial authority, household structure, and when they vote, the decision takes effect immediately. So when they read out that Camilla's official duties were being transferred to Catherine, it wasn't a suggestion. It was binding. But here's where it gets weird. The council could enforce the removal temporarily, but only Charles could make it permanent. And according to multiple accounts, Charles just sat there. He watched his wife's face change when Catherine's name was read aloud. He watched her reach for the back of a carved chair. He heard her whisper, "This cannot be final." And then he watched her knees buckle. That's not a normal reaction from the man who supposedly approved the decision in the first place. If Charles was fully on board, why did he freeze halfway across the room? Why did William have to be the one to call for help? That detail alone makes the whole thing feel less like a coordinated palace decision and more like a situation that spiraled out of Charles's control. Catherine wasn't even in the chamber. She was deliberately kept away so nobody could accuse her of orchestrating Camilla's downfall. That's smart politics, honestly. But it also meant Catherine found out she was receiving one of the most powerful positions in the royal household with zero preparation. And from what we're hearing, she didn't react with excitement. She reportedly sat with the council letter in her lap, stared at the final paragraph and said, "I never asked to take anything from her." William was right there. He didn't argue with her. He told her he knew because he understood something that a lot of people watching this from the outside might miss. Catherine wasn't being rewarded, she was being used as a constitutional safeguard. The council framed the transfer as necessary because Camilla had allegedly created a second chain of command inside the palace. And that's the part that actually matters more than any dramatic collapse. For months, Camilla reportedly had control over certain household channels. These are the internal systems that carry schedules, seating orders, invitations, briefings, and ceremonial instructions from the king's office to palace staff. Normally, when Charles approves something, it goes through those channels and gets executed. But multiple sources claim that Camilla's office had been intercepting those instructions and changing them before they reached staff. So, an order would leave Charles's desk saying one thing, and by the time it reached the people responsible for carrying it out, it said something completely different. That's not just palace intrigue, that's a direct challenge to the sovereign's authority, and the Windsor investiture rehearsal is where it finally blew up. Charles had personally approved the receiving order. Catherine was supposed to stand at the front and receive guests in her role as Princess of Wales. That wasn't Catherine pushing for prominence. That was the king's decision. But before the instruction reached the staff running the ceremony, Camilla allegedly ordered an aide to remove Catherine's name and replace it with her own. And this wasn't the first time. It had been happening for months. Invitations that were approved for William and Catherine's office got changed. Ceremonial instructions were rewritten. Camilla's household was given priority in places where Charles's original order gave it to the Prince and Princess of Wales. So by the time the Windsor incident happened, Camilla had already been warned to stop interfering with decisions that came directly from the king. And she did it again anyway. That's the part that's hard to defend. If this was a one-time mistake, maybe you could call it a misunderstanding, but multiple change directives over several months. That's a pattern, and the palace staff were apparently terrified. There were reports of a junior aide in Catherine's household who received an urgent briefing meant directly for Catherine. Normally, that briefing would have gone through Camilla's office first, but because it was time-sensitive, the aide sent it straight to Catherine's private secretary. Within days, that aide was fired, and Camilla's fingerprints were allegedly all over that decision and reportedly checked the file herself after hearing similar complaints from two other staff members who were too scared to put their names on the record. That's the detail that makes this feel more serious than just two women fighting over who stands where at a ceremony. People inside the palace were afraid that bypassing Camilla, even to do their jobs correctly, could cost them their positions. That's not a healthy working environment. That's a system where loyalty to the queen consort was being treated as more important than loyalty to the actual functioning of the monarchy. William noticed, and eventually Charles was shown 3 separate directives that had left his office with one set of instructions and reached palace staff with another. When he confronted Camilla, she didn't deny it. She turned it around on William. She accused him of taking advantage of Charles's reduced workload to build his own court around Catherine and push the older generation out. That's a very specific accusation, and honestly, it's not hard to see why Camilla would feel that way. Catherine is more popular. The crowds scream louder for her. William is being prepared to inherit. Charles has been scaling back his duties. From Camilla's perspective, the monarchy was moving forward, and she was terrified it was moving forward without her. There was even this moment outside a hospital about a week before the Windsor rehearsal. Camilla stepped out of her car first. Catherine followed seconds later, and the crowd erupted for Catherine. People surged toward the barriers, phones in the air, shouting her name. Camilla barely got a reaction. One of her own senior aides leaned toward another staff member and muttered, "That's the difference now." Camilla heard it, and she carried that humiliation with her for days. Then she changed the receiving order at Windsor. The connection isn't subtle. William followed her into a side corridor and asked why she changed an instruction personally approved by his father. Camilla didn't apologize. She looked him straight in the eye and said Catherine needed to learn the difference between popularity and rank. That's a direct quote, allegedly. And it tells you everything about how Camilla was thinking. She believed that no matter how popular Catherine became, rank mattered more, and she was the queen. So in her mind, she had the right to adjust the order. The problem is that the king had already made the decision, and in a monarchy, you can't have the queen consort quietly overriding the king's instructions. That's not how the system works. Charles summoned Camilla that evening. William waited outside. The argument exploded behind closed doors. Voices rose. The door slammed open, and Charles came out with a decision William didn't expect. He was taking the entire case before the Royal Council for formal review. That's huge. This wasn't going to be handled privately anymore. Charles demanded an apology and told Camilla to surrender control of the household channel she'd been using to send instructions to senior staff. Camilla refused. She told him that giving up that control would leave her powerless inside her own marriage and exposed everyone who had spent years waiting to watch her fall. Then she reminded him of the promises he'd made to protect her long before the crown ever touched his head. That's emotional. Well, that's a wife reminding her husband of a promise, but it's also a queen consort refusing to accept that her interference had consequences. Anne was in the room, and Anne came prepared. She had the details about the fired aide. She had the pattern of changed instructions. She told Charles that palace staff were afraid, not annoyed, afraid. That changes the framing entirely. This wasn't about Camilla being rude to Catherine. It was about whether anyone could trust the king's orders if his own wife could secretly change them before staff carried them out. So Charles went to the council. The recommendation was already written. It had been reviewed. The pen was uncapped. The council examined Camilla's ceremonial title, her authority over palace staff, her access to internal information, and the powers attached to her position. They concluded she couldn't safely keep those powers. William gave the king a sealed appendix. That appendix allegedly showed that Camilla's office hadn't just changed instructions. Several important briefings meant for Catherine had been held back inside Camilla's office. Others never reached Catherine at all. One of those files concerned a major national ceremony. Because the briefing was delayed, Catherine nearly walked into that ceremony without information she needed in front of senior officials and foreign guests. One mistake in that room wouldn't have just embarrassed Catherine. It could have embarrassed the crown in front of the country and foreign representatives. That's the moment Charles finally understood how far this had gone. The council agreed to transfer Camilla's title and authority, but Charles asked for one final night. That night, he offered Camilla a deal. She could surrender the title herself, keep some ceremonial privileges, keep part of her personal staff, and let the palace tell the public she had chosen to step back gracefully. That would have protected her dignity. It would have allowed her to frame it as her own decision. Camilla said nothing. She waited until Charles left. Then she tore the unsigned statement in half. She claimed that signing it would erase her entire life. Before dawn, she formally rejected the proposal in writing, and that was it. Hours later, the council turned its recommendation into a binding order. Charles spent that night alone in another wing of the palace. His final attempt to protect Camilla's dignity had failed. Not because she wasn't given a choice, but because she refused the choice she was offered. That's the part that gets lost in the drama. Camilla wasn't blindsided without options. She was given a graceful exit, and she rejected it. So the palace moved forward without her cooperation. The next morning, Camilla called her longtime personal assistant from her private study and asked her to handle something routine. The assistant hesitated. Then she told Camilla she could no longer take instructions from her directly. As of that morning, she reported to Catherine's office. Any request from Camilla now had to go through Catherine's household channel first. Camilla went quiet. She asked the assistant to repeat herself. Then she put the phone down without finishing the call. That's the moment the power transfer became real, not in the council chamber, not in the official documents, in a phone call with an assistant who suddenly had to tell the Queen that she no longer had the authority to give orders. That's brutal. And it happened before Camilla even fully processed what the council had done. After recovering from the collapse, Camilla refused to speak to Charles. Instead, she asked for a private meeting with Catherine. Catherine agreed, even though William warned her that Camilla might pressure her into rejecting the title. When they met, Camilla asked the question she'd been waiting to ask. "Did you know about all this?" Catherine said no. She hadn't known the council would act that morning. She never asked for Camilla's removal. She admitted that receiving the transfer document had left her shaken, not triumphant. That's when Camilla dropped her guard. She admitted that Catherine's popularity had frightened her. Every crowd that cheered louder for Catherine, every new responsibility William received, every reduction in Charles's workload made Camilla feel like her place inside the monarchy was disappearing. And instead of accepting it, she fought it. That's honest. It's also exactly the kind of fear that leads to the behavior the council punished. Catherine admitted something too. She had considered refusing the title. William stopped her. He warned that refusing it would reopen the entire power struggle and weaken the council's decision. So Catherine accepted, but she didn't celebrate. She removed the ceremonial brooch before stepping out of the car that afternoon. She refused to look like she was celebrating another woman's fall. Her handwritten statement honored Camilla's years of service and promised stability, duty, and respect. Not one word about victory. That's smart. It's also probably sincere. Catherine has spent years building a reputation for discipline and restraint. Accepting this title with visible satisfaction would have undone a lot of that work in a single afternoon. The palace released a formal bulletin confirming the transfer, but it left out the changed orders, the delayed briefings, and the staff members who were afraid to challenge Camilla's office. The country split almost immediately. Some called it necessary discipline, others called it the public humiliation of the king's wife. Charles stayed out of sight and asked for the television to be switched off. Later that day, he went to Camilla's room one final time. Her ceremonial seal was already gone. Her official folder had been removed. Charles placed his hand on the table between them, his wedding ring still on his finger, and told Camilla he still loved her. But love couldn't protect decisions that had repeatedly undermined his authority as king. Camilla finally stopped fighting. She admitted that fear had driven her choices. Catherine becoming more popular frightened her. William gaining more authority frightened her. Even Charles reducing his duties frightened her. The monarchy was moving forward and Camilla was terrified it was moving forward without her. Charles didn't reverse the order. He told her their marriage would continue. She would still be his wife. She would still stand beside him. But her power inside the institution was finished. No more senior decision-making, no more household channels, no more ability to interfere with instructions after they left the king's office. That evening, a handwritten note from Catherine arrived for Camilla. She promised to use the title to stabilize the family, not erase Camilla's years of service. And that's where the story lands. But there's one more layer that people keep forgetting. The council didn't just remove Camilla's household authority. They also placed a temporary review period on the entire consort's office. That means every remaining staff member had to be revetted. Every line of communication had to be reapproved. For a few weeks, Camilla's office effectively stopped functioning as an independent unit. That's almost unprecedented in modern royal history. Usually these transitions happen quietly over months with carefully worded announcements and soft landing arrangements. This one happened fast, and the speed is what made it so destabilizing for everyone involved. Palace staff were told not to speak to the press. Several longtime employees were reassigned without warning. One former aide reportedly packed their desk before noon and left through a side entrance without saying goodbye to anyone. It wasn't just Camilla who lost her place. It was the entire structure around her, and that's why the empty signature line keeps bothering me. Charles allowed the machinery to move forward. He allowed the council to act. He allowed the staff changes to happen. He allowed Catherine to receive the title, but he couldn't bring himself to sign the final order that would make it irreversible. Maybe that's compassion. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's the lingering hope that some future version of events would allow him to restore Camilla without publicly admitting the whole thing had been a mistake. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he just couldn't stand the thought of being the one who put the final mark on the document that ended his wife's role in the institution. Because signing it would mean accepting that the woman he fought so hard to place beside him had become a threat to the very authority he was supposed to protect. That's a heavy thing to put your name on. So the story remains unfinished. The palace moved forward, wounded, reordered, but the king's signature remained unwritten. And as long as that line stays empty, Camilla's fall isn't permanent. It's just suspended, waiting for a pen that Charles still hasn't picked up.